One.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective. We're still covering the war in Israel, day 30 of the war. Our topic today is going to be humanitarian corridors and the way Hamas has abused these in the last few days. And we're going to be talking about the idea of humanitarian aid in general and some of the calls that have come out. Just to start with the news update, the current death toll of soldiers is standing at 28. The death toll for Israelis is currently 1,538 overall, including civilians, and 9,061 Palestinians. So the death toll is creeping ever higher and ever higher. There's been a missile attack in northern Israel from Hezbollah in Lebanon, which killed an Israeli civilian, which launched a retaliatory attack by the IDF, which killed three Lebanese civilians. So unfortunately, the skirmishes which have been with Hezbollah in the north are going to be escalating. Netanyahu today expelled the heritage minister, whose name, if I'm pronouncing this rightly, is Amichai Eliyahu. He's part of the far-right Jewish Power Party, apparently, and he made some comments that actually I didn't think were too unreasonable. They might be tactically wrong, but he made comments suggesting that when asked by a journalist whether he would use nuclear weapons, he said it was a possibility, which is what he said. And then when he was pressed on this and said that, and questions about whether there were hostages in Gaza that should be accounted for, he said that whilst he very much wants them to be saved, why do their lives matter more than soldiers? I actually don't think that's too unreasonable. He might still be wrong about that, but that's caused him to be expelled from the government. And what else have we got? Oh, and the Pope, this feeds into our topic, has called for humanitarian aid again and for the parties to stop in the name of God, as if that would make a difference. So that's our news update for today.
Aren't they fighting in the name of God?
It's a relevant question, isn't it? So, Mark, we're talking about the humanitarian corridor for getting foreign nationals out of the country. And just to give some stats, I guess, we've had at least 100 British people be evacuated through this humanitarian corridor and 400 Americans. And an equivalent kind of thing has been suspended on the Egyptian border because the ambulances which were getting injured Palestinians out through Egypt were found to be housing Hamas fighters. So another way that these have been abused. So what do you think about humanitarian corridors and how they've been assaulted by Hamas?
Yeah, I think that all these calls for humanitarian anything over there is going to be exploited by Hamas to further their war effort. I'm for getting American nationals out of there, people who want to be out of the region, out of there as quickly as possible, but not in such a way as to enable the Hamas fighters to gather more strength or use human shields to harm more Israeli soldiers and more innocents. I think the general call for humanitarian aid to an enemy that is aggressing on a neighbor is overall rather morally twisted. You should certainly send humanitarian aid to a defender who's being aggressed upon, but the aggressor, I think, has no claim to any of that aid at all, and the responsibility of the people fighting is to end the aggression completely and entirely and forever. So it's no surprise that Hamas is abusing humanitarian corridors for their own purposes. They always have, they always will. And so it's a rather complicated scenario when such abuses exist, when you want to also get nationals out of there, particularly American nationals.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think Razi's view on them is that he thinks they shouldn't happen full stop. They're too risky. I think I probably am more of your opinion that it's a good thing to try and get foreign nationals out of there. That's what you want if you're in Israel's position. I think you probably can screen out foreign passport holders and make sure that there's not Hamas fighters who are coming out. And obviously, what we've seen with the humanitarian corridor in the north is that Hamas has launched attacks on Israeli soldiers. So the thing about people calling for humanitarian aid is, whilst I'm certainly not a bloodthirsty person, and I understand a general kind of desire to help innocent people, and I certainly agree with wanting to get foreign nationals out. Hamas doesn't play that game. It doesn't play ball with that at all. And so when we are very sort of bleeding heart and trying to play the game, as it were, in sort of an honorable way, they exploit that. So Luckily, no one was killed, but they tried to kill Israeli soldiers who were letting innocent people out of the war zone. So, I think we sometimes need to have our heads looked at to check that they're screwed on properly. We need to remember the identity of the entity in action here, which is Hamas, which is inherently violent. This isn't like some honorable organization who's going to kind of reciprocate our generosity. They're going to exploit it at every turn.
Yeah, and it's not bloodthirsty to acknowledge that reality. People like us who are morally on the side of the innocent deplore the fact that these people put us in a position where innocents have to be killed in order to stop them. But that's not on us; that's on them. It's a fairly simple ethical calculus that lots of people can't seem to be making. Do you have any suggestions as to why that is? It's as if because, let's say, we wouldn't want these corridors to exist to the degree that they do, we don't want humanitarian aid coming to the enemy, and because we say, the civilian deaths, the innocent deaths that result from here on out are on Hamas's head, that we are somehow warmongering, bloodthirsty people, as if we don't acknowledge that it's a very painful thing for us to have to. It's a traumatic thing for a soldier to have to kill, an innocent person in his attempt to kill the bad guys. That he can have to live with that for the rest of his life. That's what Hamas made him do.
Yeah, it's an angle, I guess, that doesn't get spoken about a lot, but there's a tremendous disrespect to the soldiers involved, who are very courageous people who, as like anyone else, are very possibly going to be left with PTSD for the rest of their life from this conflict. But about your question, why, I think you asked, why do people act this way, or why do they support humanitarian corridors and act as if opposing that is bloodthirsty? It could be for a variety of reasons. On the show the other day, Razzie and I were talking about Owen Jones, who's like a very left-wing British journalist. And for the people who aren't kind of, I guess, confused average citizens, for the people who are kind of diehard pro-Palestine people who are kind of dressing up what they're doing as being humanitarian and having a bleeding heart, and all they care about is civilians, I think there's something really deeply wrong going on. And I don't think it's too far to say evil going on. I think that they, in some sense, are longing for the destruction of a good thing, which is Israel, and ultimately voicing support for Hamas. And the funny thing about when we were talking about Owen Jones is Owen Jones kind of knew that he was doing that. He could understand that opposing a ceasefire was supporting Israel. So he would be able to understand the logic that supporting a ceasefire is tacitly supporting Hamas. And so I think they want the destruction of Israel. They want to support a destructive agent, which is Hamas. So at its worst iteration, I think it is nihilism, as Rand put it, the hatred of the good for being the good. And at a lower level, people are raised Christian. They're raised with a kind of bleeding heart kind of mentality, which softens you up when you have to be decisive, when you have to go to war and do things like that. It means that you're weak in the face of the end. And that's, I think, explicitly what Christianity wants to make true.
Yeah, and it makes you it makes you sort of equivocate with respect to your values. It makes you egalitarian, I should say, in respect to your values, so that your values are no longer related to what the person does, what they represent, what ideologies they're fighting for. It's simply whether or not they're being, they're being pressured or made to suffer, and your empathy then becomes your guide for right or wrong, and it's completely separate from what the character of the individual or group of individuals is that you're feeling the empathy for. I feel zero empathy for Hamas. I feel terrible. I feel tons of empathy for the IDF, who's put in the position by Hamas to kill civilians, innocent civilians. And what I mean by innocent civilians are children who haven't been indoctrinated yet, if such exist in Gaza. Those IDF soldiers are going to have to live with that terror their entire lives, and it's a psychological terror that was planted there by Hamas on purpose, So yeah, it's nihilism uses altruism and empathy for its gain, like any pathotype, right? Any con man, any criminal will sometimes work on the better angels of your nature and your naivete and your lack of suspicion that somebody could be so horrible in order to advance their own agenda. And that's sort of what I see going on today in the world.
Yeah. I think I would be, I don't know what your thoughts about this. I'll see if you agree. I think some people find it difficult, the idea that you could never kind of negotiate with the opponent in a way. And if I think it comes down to this core issue. If the nature of the enemy were different, if you were fighting an enemy who you could, so let's say you had civilians trapped there, and if you could actually negotiate with them and say, look, we want to get these people out, we have something that we can offer you, and let's not kill these people. I think there are certain situations in war where you maybe could do that. I think that they're not very common, but there have been some wars in the past where governments have made agreements like that, and you can help, you can get people out, or you can order temporary truces to go and claim dead bodies and things like that. Whilst I think you have to be very careful about doing that because you want to make sure you're never kind of disadvantaging yourself, I think you can do that kind of thing sometimes. But ultimately, I find it.
When
Well, see, this is tricky. I think that that was done sometimes in the First World War, for example. They would organize a kind of temporary truce to go and claim the bodies of people and or injured soldiers. And that's kind of, you can see where it's mutually beneficial. Like, I want to get my injured soldiers who are stuck in no man's land. You want to get yours. Let's agree not to go kill each other whilst we do that. I think that's actually plausible to do sometimes. Um, but what you're dealing with in that situation is not an enemy like Hamas. And I might be wrong about that. I'd be interested to hear whether you think those situations are possible. But when you're dealing with Hamas, if you try to organize something like that, as we saw with the humanitarian corridor, they'll just exploit it. So if there was some equivalent situation where you had injured soldiers in no man's land, and so did they, and you organized to go and get them and not try and kill each other, they would just kill you whilst you were doing that. Whether they screw their fighters, they would just want to kill you.
Yeah, criminal states like North Korea, Russia, Iran, China, they use hostages as political tokens to force concessions out of people who actually value life, which they don't. That's a massive generalization. I'm not saying individuals within those countries don't value life, but certainly their leaders don't. Their leaders are using them in a geopolitical chess game that they want to win, and their purpose is a sort of a domination of sorts. And for criminals like that, you cannot negotiate. I think that Americans and or Israelis have to presume that the hostages are dead. They should try to find them if they can, but they should presume that they're dead and act accordingly, and not give 1 inch to the international pressure for pauses and ceasefires to exchange hostages. I mean, let's face it, the last time Israel did this, it released something like 1,000 or so prisoners. That's even more for one Israeli soldier. And some of those people ended up going back into populating Hamas and causing the very terror that we're seeing today. And I think they want something like an exchange of somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 30,000 fighters, which I think is absurd. So yeah, no, you should never negotiate with pathotypes like this, and that's what Hamas is. They're pathotypes. They want power, they want domination, and they'll do anything to get it.
And I guess jumping off that, related to what I mentioned in the news update, this Israeli minister who was fired from the government, and the news articles were calling him far right. He's part of the Jewish Power Party. I know nothing about that, but that sounds like a dodgy group to me. Mm-hmm. But actually, his comments I didn't think were so unreasonable. Whether you should be using nuclear weapons in Gaza and that's, as Leonard Peacock, I think, once said when he spoke about the issue of nuclear weapons, it's up for the army to decide whether that's wise to do, because you've obviously got a huge potential for nuclear radiation to come in and affect Israel, because Gaza is such a small area, which you would need to consider whether it's in your self-interest to do. But I mean, I don't know. Like, he was fired from the government for not even suggesting they do it, but saying it's an option. That's basically what he said. It's a possibility that you do that. Do you think that's
Look,
so?
I mean, I remember Leonard Peikoff getting kicked off the O'Reilly show for saying the same thing about Iran and never going back on that show again. And he modified his statement to say, well, it's really a military decision. The military has to are the only ones qualified to make those kinds of claims. But I think if you're a defender, defending yourself against aggression, you should do so by any means necessary and by the means that will assure the least loss of life. Right now, we have incursions going into Israel where IDF soldiers are subjecting themselves to live fire from Hamas, agents for Hamas, fighters for Hamas who are popping up from the tunnels. They're being prohibited from dropping bombs and bunker busting bombs into these tunnels and destroying them outright without losing a single IDF soldier by the international community. So far, what, 28 soldiers have died, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 overall in this fight, when it should be zero, unless we're talking about the ones who took the initial onslaught on October 7th. From the point of the Israeli offensive, there should be zero IDF casualties. And the way to do that is to, bomb the tunnels out of existence so that they don't have to go in there like tunnel rats and face booby traps and squadrons of people who are prepared, who have bunkered down and are prepared to fight them and to kill as many of them as possible before they themselves die. It's just stupid. Your object is to defend yourself, and defend yourself until the threat is over with minimal amount of damage to yourself. And yet our altruistic world sees that as a moral faux pas to the highest degree.
Yeah. This is a question I've been wondering about recently, and we discussed it on the show a little while ago, and people weren't too sure. I'm just interested in picking your brain on this. It doesn't seem to me that the West has been so altruistic in our foreign policy for most of our history. Like, I think in the past we've had a better attitude towards war, and I don't think it would occur to most people, or the issue would never raise in their minds, like these kind of altruistic considerations with the soldiers. I think they'd be much more kind of psychologically healthy, I think is probably how Rand put it once, that they would want to defend their own soldiers and they wouldn't feel the inclination to take these actions which would put them at risk, or which would be wanting to kind of aid the enemy in a way. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about where this comes from? Or because it seems to me post World War II, a lot of this kind of sentiments come up. Do you have any thoughts about why we've become more like this?
Well, I know that objectivists have noted the rise of just war theory and its predominance, I think, in the military community, that sets rules of war that are not kind to the folks who are attempting to win a war. It makes it next to impossible to fight, and I think those were the result of fighting some of the asymmetrical wars that we were fighting post Korea, when we were fighting communism by proxy, fighting Russia and China by proxy, and fighting civilian populations or military populations that were embedded in the civilian populations, and subjected those populations to lots of death and mayhem, which people post World War II were quite appalled by. And so the just war principles, I think, resonates with a lot of people as a fair way of fighting. Unfortunately, it denies essential realities of warfare, which are that war is ugly, it's bad, and oftentimes has to be taken to the civilian population in order for them to know that the ideology they're following will lead to death and destruction. Let's face it, I don't know that it was until Sherman marched through Georgia and took the war to the rich Southern planter elites and burned their plantations to the ground, that the South really understood what the war was all about. You know, that war could have dragged on and on and on forever until Sherman made them realize war is hell. And likewise, you know, there's been tons of moral outrage against the firebombing of Tokyo and the firebombing of Dresden. Lots of moral outrage by our quote unquote intellectuals and philosopher class. But you know, we're talking about a population that largely supported Shintoism on the one hand and fascism on the other. And they needed to know that those two ideologies bring death and destruction to their doorsteps, as they brought death and destruction to the doorsteps of Manchuria and to China and to everywhere else that the imperialist Japanese and the fascist Nazis and Italians conquered. There's just no other way around it. War is an ugly, horrible thing. It's a traumatic thing, and taking away, robbing a soldier's autonomy and robbing his moral capacity to fight for his own life and to sacrifice it for others doesn't ease the tragedy at all. What it in fact ends up doing is keeping us in a state of perpetual warfare. I mean, if I'm sure you've noticed it, since 2001, we've been in a state of war. We've been in war for 22 years. The Vietnam War was a war that lasted for over 10 years. Wars governed by this ideology do not end because you don't repudiate the ideology.
Yeah, it's it was funny. I was hosting a meeting of the Edinburgh Ayn Rand meetup today, and we were reading Rand's The Roots of War, and it felt very timely given what we're discussing. I'm just going to read some of the super chats just while we've got a moment. So Bonnie gave us a $1. Thank you very much, Bonnie, for your continued support. And Phil gave us £5, saying, "Ceasefire when all Israeli victims suddenly reincarnated by Allah. So start praying." I'm not too sure what he's getting at there. I don't know if you know, Mark. And then Jonathan Honig gave us $4. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Did you get what Phil was saying there?
I guess it means never cease fire. I don't know.
I guess so, maybe. Yeah. I think your comparison I think the example of Imperial Japan is a useful one, because in that situation, their ideology meant that they were an unusually resilient enemy who would who would fight the Second World War, to a point of extreme self-abnegation, like completely beyond any interest of their civilians and so on and so forth. And the populace had really been kind of indoctrinated into this ideology. And from my understanding of Hamas and how they've governed in Palestine, I think there's a strong comparison to be made, that they're really driven by nihilism, this war, that it's not like they have some reasonable objectives they're trying to achieve and so on and so forth. They would really just like destruction, and they view their population as disposable to achieving destruction.
And many of the population themselves, I don't know how big a percentage, but view themselves in that way too. I've seen women interviewed. Now, in a totalitarian state, it's difficult to say whether these women who are interviewing are doing it to please the authorities, whether they're actually speaking their own mind, or what their actual purpose is. But I've seen women talking about Palestinian women breeding children for the cause. Their sole purpose is to breed martyrs. And I don't know if you heard the telephone call of the jihadist, the Hamas fighter, bragging to his father and to his mother that he killed 10 Jews. Did you hear this? And the father's praising God. The son is saying, "Your son is a hero. Your son is a hero." His mother is crying, not for sadness, not for the moral depravity of her son, but for joy. She's crying for joy because now her son, when he dies, as he should, will become a martyr and go to heaven for doing what he did. That's a society that's been conditioned to a pathology that that is just extremely difficult to root out surgically. You simply can't. I mean, you have to make sure they know that that ideology leads to utter and total destruction, so that they never, if they feel the impulse to pick up a gun or a grenade or a homemade rocket launcher, they don't do it because they know the consequences will be too extreme.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that particular voicemail, but I saw some reporting of, yeah, of mothers of the um, terrorists who went in on the 7th of October saying how proud they were of their sons. And the stomach turning thing about it is that you have to wonder, kind of like you were saying, is how much support is there amongst the general Palestinian population for this kind of thing. And I can't, like you said, we can't measure it for sure, but it seems like there's notable support for this. I can't say whether it's a majority or minority or whatever, but it's more than is pleasing to contemplate. Let's put it that way.
It's certainly high. You don't get networks of tunnels under schools and hospitals without civilian help and without civilian knowledge. People either turning a blind eye to what's going on or passively and or actively supporting what's happening. So, I mean, that certainly blurs the distinction between combatant and innocent civilian.
Yeah,
And the indoctrination starts so young. I'm sure you've seen the videos of kids pointing rifles and chanting, the things that they're told to chant. It's straight out of that KKK documentary, that with Blood on the Fist, I think it's called, where you see these little kids being indoctrinated as neo-Nazis by their parents. It's abuse. It's despicable, and it needs to be stopped.
yeah, no, 100%. Just as we wrap up, because I'm nearing the end of the show, I was going to say, I think one thing that we've seen in a lot of this is people posting footage on Twitter of airstrikes. Now, we've seen some footage coming from Israel of the attacks on the 7th of October, but we've also seen footage posted from inside Gaza of the aftermath of some Israeli airstrikes. And people have been posting them as if obviously, and these videos, the ones I've seen, are of dead children, mangled, blood everywhere, bodies burned. Like, it's truly horrifying, but they post it in a way that's as if it's self-evident that therefore there should be a ceasefire. And I think one of the things we should maybe do in the next week or so is something inspired by Dr. Peikoff's lecture, "A Picture is Not an Argument," and talk about that a little bit, because I think that might be useful.
I was just thinking about that, and how he was going to do a debate with somebody on abortion, provided that the pro-abortion person did not bring pictures, and that, I thought, inspired his concept that a picture is not an argument, and it certainly isn't. And we should talk about it, because Hamas has an extremely sophisticated PR wing, and they love these photo ops. I mean, for them, it's grist for the mill. It gins up hatred against Israel, which is exactly what they want. I've been witnessing it online. I've seen people turn in the most ugly ways because of the pictures that they're showing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of their PR machine as well is done voluntarily by Western media, which is just despicable. Daniel, just as we finish, do we have any announcements?
No announcements for today, but we'll be back tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. UK time instead of 6, but we'll have the reality show at 6.
Fantastic. All right, guys, we'll see you guys tomorrow for TDO and the reality show. Thanks for joining me, Mark.
All right, thanks for having me, Morgan. Peace.
Cheers.